Rick Houston. Neil Thompson did not grow up in the Southeast, so he was not immersed in Southern culture like a lot of us were from birth who were born in the Southeast. But he moved to North Carolina, and he wound up writing the best book that I've ever read on stock car racing's first and earliest days, and it's called Driving with the Devil. If you haven't picked it up, do yourself a favor and go out and get it now. Order it on Amazon, order it online, go to the bookstore. Just get a copy of this book. You will not regret it. You will get to know the people who made and shaped this sport. You'll get to know them like never before. Neil did that job, and he did it so incredibly well. And in this episode, we sat down with Neil to talk about the research and talk about the links to which he went to get some of the interviews that he did. He talks about some of the key characters in that book, and there were plenty of them to go through. But Neil, he's a good guy, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation. All right, so Neil, first of all, I got to tell you, I used to work for Winston Cup Scene, the newspaper, and have archived all the issues and everything. So my expertise in NASCAR history is mostly limited to the years that Winston Cup Scene was in business, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And I didn't know a lot about the sport's earliest days. I knew the Red Byrons and I knew the highlights. But until I got hold of Driving with the Devil, I don't know that I had the appreciation for the sport's earliest days that you gave me. So I guess my first question would be, how did the idea for that project come about? I mean, is it something that you are already interested in? Did somebody pitch you the idea, or how did it happen?
Yeah. First, thanks for doing this. It's great to see you again. It's been a while. It's also been a while since I've talked about NASCAR in those early days, so I might be rusty, but
It's a
um,
test. There'll be a test later.
yeah, just give me the C plus now, and we'll call it good. Um, but no, like I got really interested and curious. I guess you could call it. So the book came out. What was it? 2006. I'd say a good 10 years before that, like everybody else in the country, I was watching NASCAR get bigger and bigger and bigger. So I grew up in a family where my dad was a car guy. He worked on cars all the time. We had engines, in pieces in our basement. But he was mainly a sort of sports car guy, and he would take us to sports car races. I forget what the circuit was called back then. But we would go to like Glen Rock in New York and Pocono Raceway and that kind of thing, me and my little brother. But it wasn't NASCAR racing, this is up in New Jersey, so it was that kind of sport. Um, but then jump ahead to when I'm seeing NASCAR sort of explode and become this national sport, and I wanted to know, where did it all start? And I kind of like you, I would come across sort of the surface level sort of explanation. Oh, it was, these moonshiners back in the day, and then Bill France took over, and then it became NASCAR. But I wanted to know, well, who were those early guys? Was it all Bill France? When did it really start? There had to be sort of this backstory, origin story to the whole thing. That's what I wanted to figure out. I wanted to know who were some of the early racers, mechanics, promoters, before it was even called NASCAR or anything else. So literally picked up my family. We were living in Baltimore around that time, and I got deeper and deeper into this project. I was working for the Baltimore Sun. I was a journalist like you, and decided to leave that job and move to North Carolina and sort of be closer to the people and the history and the research for it. And that's what we did. We moved to just outside of Asheville, and that gave me access to sort of the people who were still alive at that time, and many of them have unfortunately passed on. But I think the timing was right. Some of the old timers were, still going strong in their 70s and 80s, and they were willing to talk about it and in a way that maybe they hadn't been decades earlier, including the sort of the guy I consider the main character of my book and the main force behind the early days of NASCAR, Raymond Parks.
You know, the book that I wrote on the history, well, the mission control, the people who worked in mission control during the Apollo era, I had favorite characters who grew on me,
Yeah.
and they almost became like family members. I got to know them so well. Who were some of those characters in Driving with the Devil, for you personally?
Yeah. And it's an interesting to hear you describe that. That is the process, and it has been for me with every book. I've written 6 books so far, but I think Driving with the Devil's the one where I really had to um, show a lot of these characters, for lack of a better word. I mean, they're human beings, but I had to show a lot of these old dudes that I was in it for the right reason. Like I had to convince them that I wanted to tell their story and get it right. So, for example, Raymond Parks. At the time when I moved to North Carolina, I learned, oh, everybody said you got to talk to Raymond Parks. He knows the whole story. He was there back then.
He was the whole story.
He was the whole story.
Yeah.
Um, but they said he might talk to you, he might not. I'm a Yankee. I'm a guy from New Jersey, and I'm coming down to talk to this Georgia guy. And the dynamic early on was, yeah, no, I'm not going to talk to you. I went to see him a couple times he still worked at a liquor store. He owned a liquor store in, I forget the street now, North something. Anyway, just north of downtown Atlanta. He owned his last remaining liquor store. He previously owned many of them. But I would go there, call him up and say, hey, I just want to swing by and tell you about this project I'm working on, pick your brain a little bit. And he'd say, you can come by. I don't remember that much, but come on by. And Asheville to Atlanta, it's like 4 hours. So I'd go there, spend maybe an hour and get nothing. I'd call him up a month later and say, hey, we talked about this one little piece. Can I come back and we'll talk a little bit more? Next time, maybe he'd open up a little bit more. And it took me months of doing this, and showing up and showing him that I was interested and showing him that I was talking to other people and learning more about the history of the sport. And then he started opening up. It helped that his wife, Violet, was there, and she'd sometimes nudge him like, go ahead, Raymond, tell him about that one time or tell him about that story. But there was this turning point, and you probably have experienced this. There is often in a book project where he finally brought out these photo albums, kind of reluctantly, but there were I don't know how many of them, a lot. He saved a lot, and we would just start going through these photos, and I get chills thinking about it now. He'd open a page and there's Roy Hall, leaning against an old, Ford V8 from the 30s. Next page is Lloyd C. wearing coveralls after a race. And he would show me these photos, and I would just gently try and get him to open up about it. Who's that? Where were you? What do you remember about that? And that's how he got the ball rolling, and that's how he came to trust me. And the book never would have happened without him, because he, like you said, he is the whole story, and he has such a good memory of things, and I realize he probably took to the grave, he's since passed, but took to the grave way more stories than he was willing to
Yeah.
share with a guy like me. But at least he was willing to share enough that I could bring some of that era and those people from back in the day to life and give him credit for what he did for that sport.
For those of our listeners who may or may not know who Raymond was, uh, who was he? Why was he the story?
Yeah. Raymond grew up on a farm in Dawsonville, Georgia. I think his dad married after Raymond's mom. Anyway, like 14 to 16 kids on this farm. And Raymond would drive his daddy's car to get liquor for him. His dad was a bad drunk. Raymond never drank, or rarely. Anyway, Raymond ends up in jail and at age 14, and happens to bump into a moonshiner when he's in behind bars. I forget the guy's name. And the guy says, well, when you get out, come work for me. I'll show you how to do it right. And for the next few years, Raymond ran moonshine for this guy, and this guy took him under his wing. So Raymond learned the business of moonshine, delivering jars into Atlanta mainly. That was the main customer base. He learned to make it. He learned good from bad. He learned to drive fast. He learned to drive on dirt. And as his business, he later went into business for himself as a moonshiner back in Dawsonville. And he would hire family members, mainly cousins, to drive for him, to drive his liquor down into to Atlanta. Um, you needed fast cars, you needed strong cars, reliable, sturdy. Mainly these were Ford V8s that the guys in Atlanta preferred for delivering moonshine. So he, became really good at this one business, moonshine, and then he and his cousins realized we got fast cars. Maybe we'll blow off some steam on the weekend and go to one of these races that are popping up around Atlanta at these dirt tracks, and see how we do against other racers. It was really a all this a homegrown sport. It was just a bunch of guys in their regular cars, or maybe it was the moonshine cars. They performed the best out at a country fair racetrack or a horse track, or they just make their own track by spinning dirt around an oval, and they'd race each other. Starting in the 30s is when stock began. There are examples of it before that, but at least Southern stock car racing in that Atlanta, North Carolina, South Carolina area started mainly in the 30s. And Raymond, I argue in the book, was the one who first figured out, like, there's something here. Let's get serious about it. Let's not just make it a hobby. Let's find a good mechanic. They did. Raymond worked with this worked for many years with Red Vote, who's another great character. Chain smoking, foul mouth, angry, grumpy old guy.
Yeah.
Wasn't that old, but genius mechanic with these, especially the Ford V8s, who helped Raymond's moonshine cars drive faster than the law enforcement cars, help them perform better on the racetrack, and they formed what I argue is like the first NASCAR team. Raymond was the owner, Red Vote was the mechanic, and then Raymond's first drivers were his cousin slash moonshine runners, Lloyd C. and Roy Hall. So that's why he's such an important figure. He really realized, well, we can do this almost professionally. And he did more of that after World War II, which we can talk about if you want, because that's when it really took off. There was sort of this lull before all these guys went off to war, and mid 1940s is when it really amped back up and became what they would call NASCAR.
Again, going back to Go Flight, my mission control book, there was a guy by the name of John Llewellyn who passed away maybe 2 or 3 months before I actually started diving in deep into researching the book. And he was the one guy who became my, he was the guy who I really really would have liked to have talked to. By far, he fought in the Korean War at age 17. He lived with horrible PTSD for the rest of his life. But he was the guy in mission control. He never let his PTSD affect him on the job. But he was also the kind of character. He got his parking pass pulled for parking in the center director's spot one time. So they pulled his parking pass, and he responded by pulling his horse trailer to a little strip mall across the street from Johnson Space Center, Manned Spacecraft Center at that time, and rode his horse into work. Pull my pass. I'll just ride my horse. Who was that person for you? I mean, there, as you mentioned, several had already passed on by the time that you started work on the book. But who was that person for you that you really would have liked to have had the chance to sit down with?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question because there are a handful of them. I guess I'd narrow it down to two. I mentioned Red Vote, who was the mechanic, but I and he had passed before I started on the book. I talked to his wife and his kids, and they shared as much as they could. but I get a sense that Red Vote wouldn't have made time for me. Like, that kind of guy, like, get
Yeah,
out of here.
yeah,
I got work to
yeah,
do.
yeah, yeah.
But I think the guy I really would have enjoyed talking to was Red Byron, who, after the war, became part of Raymond Parks' team, raced for him for years, and became, the first champion of NASCAR, won the series such as it was at that time in 1948 and again in 1949, which is the first sort of official stock car season, I guess. But he was an amazing character and a fearless racer. He served in the war as well and got injured. I write in detail in the book about how he had a bad leg, a bad left leg that got shredded with shrapnel as he was flying for the Army Air Corps over the Bering Sea up in Alaska. Their planes got fired on by I think Japanese. Anyway, crash landed and his leg was just shredded. The doctors wanted to amputate and he wouldn't let them. He said, I'm a race car driver. I need that leg. So he
Wow.
went
Yeah.
through a long period of rehabilitation to keep his leg. It was never the same. He always walked with a limp. Um, but he had to with Red Vote's help, they rigged up a special clutch pedal that had these little pegs, and his leg was in a brace often, and he would have to put his brace and the special boot, orthopedic boot, into these little pegs on the clutch pedal, and then when he would change gears, he would have to like shift his body to depress the
Wow.
clutch
Yeah.
pedal, which
Yeah.
is bonkers to me, right? Like this fast, dangerous sport, and this guy's got this, bad leg, and his leg would be bloody after a race from the chafing of the brace that it was in. Um, so he was just an incredible racer, uh, uh, super smart, not a Southerner. I think he was from Colorado originally, but he really fit right in with this whole scene. Um, and knew the ins and outs of the early days of the sport. He was there at Daytona Beach, at that first infamous meeting at the Streamline Hotel where Bill France and the others sort of came up with some of the rules and the ideas, and Bill France became so he saw it all, Red Byron. And I think he would have been a great guy to talk to if he had survived. Sickly guy. I was just looking at my book. He died in 1960 or early 1960s. He was just 44. He was
Wow.
going out to talk to Anheuser-Busch, in fact, to join up one of their race teams. Had a meal, went back to his hotel, and never woke up. 44. So yeah, he would
Wow.
have been a good one to talk to.
The pictures of him, the famous one of him kind of sitting on the seat of his race car and he's covered in dirt. He looks like he's 60.
Yeah, right, right. He looks
And
like an old man.
yeah, he looks like he's 60. And then, 10, 15 years after he raced or won his first championship, he was only 44. So, yeah, that I think that photo speaks volumes about, the life that he had lived.
Yeah, yeah, hard life. A lot of them lived hard lives,
Yeah.
and
Uh, you mentioned it earlier about moonshining, obviously with Raymond, but that was what was the connection? We have all these images and we have all these legends about, hey, my moonshine car is faster than yours. Let's go out and prove it in the field and drive around in circles, and we'll call it the fastest after the race. Um, how realistic is that? How is that true?
yeah. Well, it's interesting, Rick. I think that was one of my key questions when I went into the project. Like when I first started this, I would hear sort of that generic description. Oh, it all started with moonshiners and then it became NASCAR. Well,
Right.
I wanted to know what does that mean? Like, did one really lead to the other? And if so, how? And if so, who were the guys doing it? That was kind of what I went into this looking for. It was real um, evidence of that trajectory, right? And it was absolutely true. Most can't say most because it's hard to sort of do a tally, but many of the early racers from the definitely the 1930s and then into the 1940s, it sort of tapered off late 1940s. They all got their start running moonshine because learned how to drive fast on dirt, literally. And it was a life or death thing for many of them, getting away from an ATF agent or a sheriff's deputy or a local cop. They learned how not only to drive fast and drive well on dirt, they learned how to do all these tricks to their cars, prop up the suspension, weld or tie the door shut so they didn't get crushed in a crash. All these sort of things that became staples of how you treated a car on the track during the first decades of stock car racing, all tie back to things that these guys learned and their mechanics learned running moonshine. Um, and the cars themselves too were specific to moonshine. These Ford V8s V8 coupes that were the preferred moonshiner car because they had a giant trunk that could hold many crates of whiskey and a strong suspension, which they also added, some more support along the way. But these were felt like they were built for running moonshine, and those were the same cars that were among the first stock car race cars on these tracks. So you can draw truly a direct line from the history and legend of moonshining to the racetrack and to NASCAR. And I think what's interesting too to me and became interesting as I got deeper was I I think why it was tricky to find the truth of that was because NASCAR itself later wanted to wash some of that dirty history away. Bill France wasn't a moonshiner, didn't like a lot of those guys. He wanted it to be a family friendly sport, or at least a more accessible sport. He wanted to, sort of get rid of that stain of the early days of the sport. And I think that's why for many decades even you didn't read about or hear about some of those early days. Like other sports, you learn about the early heroes. I was surprised when I started this book to learn that some of these early heroes were just kind of put off to the side here, weren't
Yeah.
weren't held up as the founders and creators because of that moonshining connection.
All right, good deal. Well, I know that you said that you're on deadline, so I want to be respectful of that. Is there anything else about that era of your career when you were doing the research and writing and just immersed in our world, in the world of racing? Anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I guess there are a couple things that come to mind. You had mentioned Go Flight, your book on NASA and flight control, and as we talked by email earlier, I wrote a biography of Alan Shepard, first American in space. So I spent some time with the astronaut crowd back in the day, talked to John Glenn and Wally Schirra and Gordon Cooper and all those early guys. Um, and it was another example of getting immersed in a world that wasn't my world. And I think that's what I love about writing books and previously writing journalism is immersing myself in a world that's not my own and sort of bringing them to life and bringing an outsider's perspective to it. And I kind of miss some of that and miss being around, I'll be honest, at a time like this politically in this country, it was great to be around people who were like just a little bit different from me, had different perspectives on things. I could learn from them, vice versa. I kind of enjoyed that. And I don't know if I've found that kind of, I don't know. I don't know if I've had as much fun on a book as I did with Driving with the Devil.
All right,
It was a
good deal.
blast.
Well,
And
you
I
were
and I got
you
to
were in
load up on
God's
a lot of
country.
moonshine. What's that?
You were in God's country.
It was, yeah. Yeah. And I feel bad now. I mentioned we lived outside of Asheville. I hope everything's coming back together. Over time there, they really got hammered and it breaks my heart.
My wife is the district court judge, and we actually spent a couple of days in Asheville last week. And it's out of the news cycle now,
Yeah.
by large part. But it's going to be a long time before that area gets back to normal. I mean, no restaurants were serving tap water, or everything that they were serving was canned drinks. It's going to be months and months before they are able to treat the water again. because it's so contaminated. So yeah, the area in which you lived was very hard hit.
Yeah, yeah, I feel bad.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, one last thing I'll leave your listeners with, Rick, is because moonshine introduced me to bourbon, and I've had been a bourbon drinker for many years, a little less now than I used to. But I have a newsletter that I publish every month or so called Blood and Whiskey. It's on Substack, and it's reviews of book reviews, mainly crime fiction, and then whiskey cocktails. So if anybody's interested in getting the newsletter, it's called Blood and Whiskey.
All right, man. Good deal. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And just talking to Neil and asking him about some of the legends who were portrayed in his book, like obviously Raymond Parks and Red Byron and Red Vo, and Roy Hall, and just so many people stand out in the book. And again, like I said in the intro, do yourself a favor. If you've not already read Driving with the Devil, you need to go out and you need to pick it up and you need to go through it. And if you have, let us know in the comments who you think stood out. Who were those key participants in those earliest days of NASCAR who made the sport what it eventually became? I hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll be back soon with another.